Hi there everybody, this is Patrick from Lost in Games, and today we are going to be reviewing 1944, The War in the West by White Dog Games. So 1944 is a war game, and it's one of those class of games where you can fight World War II in 2 to 4 hours. The game itself, they refer to it on the back credits if you take a look at it, and we're going to do a more in-depth view of this than we do some of the other games just because I want you to see some of the intricacies of the game. But they call this a beer and pretzel game. I don't think this is a beer and pretzel game. I think this is a little too complex. If I had 1 or 2 beers, I would start forgetting some of the rules and probably fail. Now, there may be smarter people out there than me that could do that. But I will say, I'm just going to say right up front, I did like this game, and for this class of games, and there are other games in this class. You have GMT has their Hitler's Right game. You have Canvas Temple Publishing has their World War II Deluxe European Theater game. There's other games where you can fight World War II or the Western Front, Western Theater, or the Pacific Theater in a few hours. I think this is a good game, a good representative, and a good time. It's I want to say it's not too complex, but it's just complex enough. You know, when people transition from board games with war thematics in them to a war game, there are some games that are probably perfect transition games. Recently I reviewed Compass Games' The Battle of the Bulge, World War II Commander. That is an awesome game. Definitely a good game for new war gamers to come in and get their feel. This is this is a very different game. This is a hex and counter game, and this is a good game if if you ever think you want to progress to World in Flames or some of those really heavy hex and counter games. This is the beginning of that journey. It has a lot of the same steps. You'll learn a lot of the key concepts that you will use. Has some very interesting rules. You really got to watch your supply. If you're not paying attention to your supply, you will lose the game. It's a combination of a good, and I hate to call it light. It's light in the war game context, but for most board game, this would be heavy. So I would say, yeah. So let's take a look at it. I'm going to do, like I said, I'm going to do a more in-depth glance at the game because I want you to see the game, I want you to see the map, and I want you to see the components. And then I will come back and I'll kind of give you my final thoughts on what I think of 1944 War in the West. Okay, so here we have the setup of 1944 War in the West. All of the setup is handled by this handy-dandy player reference card, which will walk you through how to set up and find everything. If you're good at geography, that won't take very long. If you don't know what a lot of French towns, Belgian towns, Italian towns, German towns and cities, then this is going to be a little bit more of an exercise for you to go find it out. Let me give you a hint. Go out to Google Maps, just type in the name, it'll point exactly to where it is in France, and you can get your units there. So, this is the setup. As you can see, we're going to zoom in on the board a little bit, but we have the turn tracker up in this corner right here that goes through all 14 turns. We have the area of the map where the battling is going to take place, and has a combination of British and American forces coming in on Normandy, and British and American forces coming in southern Italy, and then scattered throughout you see German units. You can also, we'll pay a closer look attention here, you'll see depots scattered all over. Those are critical for supply, so don't forget about those while you're setting this up. And then along the side you can see the terrain effects chart, and then you can also see the air power resource points tracker, and then the sequence of play right there. So let's zoom in and take a couple closer looks at different portions of the game map. Alright, we're going to take a look at southern Italy here, and here you can see all of the different counters that are in play at the start of the game. So we have our infantry counters, we have our artillery counters, and our armor counters. You have command counters representing command, And you have also depot counters, which represent your supply. Again, this game, supply is very important. It's something that's easy to forget, and the best laid plan will come crashing to the ground if you're not paying attention to your supply lines. So make sure you're paying attention to that. Units generally have a stacking limit of 4 in the game. In this case, at the start of the game, it insists that, with the exception of in Italy, most German units only stack at 1, where the Allied units can stack at 2. And that's because they're just getting their beachhead and they're just getting started. Okay? Let's take a look up in the upper corner now at the game turn and resource track. Okay, so as we've talked about in the game, there are 14 turns to this game that will take you all of the way from June 1944 every single month all the way up to January 1945. We have a turn tracker here so that every turn you'll just move the tracker along. You'll also see here alongside, next to every turn, is the resource points allotted to each of the sides during the game based on the particular month. So for example, in June 1944, the British and Americans are going to get 6 resource points, where the Germans are going to get 12 resource points. Okay? If we fast forward to September, you're going to see that the British and Americans get 15 and the Germans get 13. Right? So this changes and adjusts throughout the game as you're playing. Now let's just take a look at the different terrain effects chart. Okay. So in the upper corner here, you can see the terrain effects chart. This is a nice, easy key where you can look at any different terrain that is on the map. You can see its name, and then you can see the cost to enter it. So if you look at any particular unit at any given time, they have 2 numbers on it. The first one is in black is the movement number. That's how many movement points your counter has to move. And then underneath it is the combat factor. Okay, so when it comes to movement, you have 3 points to move for this particular infantry. If you're moving on clear terrain, it only costs 1. So you could go 1, 1, 2, 3. Okay. However, let's say you're up here and you want to pass through this marsh. Okay. So in passing through that marsh, you look up the marsh. The marsh costs 2 points to get through. So 1, 2, 3. It's more difficult to pass. So that's the first column here. The second column is a defender bonus. So obviously if you're defending in a forest, you're going to get some bonuses for defense just due to the natural cover. On the other hand, if you are in open terrain, it's going to work against you, right? It's perfectly clean. And then last but not least, you have the intervening hexes for supply. And this is a very important one because supply is so important in the game. When you're connecting the dots between the depots, if they move through difficult terrain, that means it's more difficult for your supplies to get to point A to point B. So just like the movement, you may have a hex that instead of cost 1 hex to get through, it actually costs 2, which means you have to have your depots closer together. Very important in this game. If you are not monitoring your supply, it's going to be a quick game because you are going to lose. All right, so let's go ahead and just take a look at the general counters, and then we'll move into combat. Okay, so there's 3 different sides in the game. You have the Germans, which are in gray. You have the Americans, which are in green. And then last but not least, you have the British, which are in brown. So if you take a look at the counters, you have infantry, you have armor, you have artillery, you have depots, you have paratroopers, and you have artillery, and last but not least, you have command units. Every particular counter, you can flip it over, and it has a weakened side. So like we said before, the top number is your movement points, the bottom number is your combat number that you will be using when you are doing your battles. The counters themselves, they are pretty darn good. There may not be the prettiest counters, but they are effective. And I don't know what it is. This is one of those games that is made with, looks like it is made more by a printing on demand. I've seen this from Hollandspiel, etc. The counters here, there's something about them. Like I said, they may not be the prettiest, but man, they are tough. They feel solid. Or sometimes in war games you have cardboard counters that are just like the cheapest cardboard. This is not. These things, I want to say if I glued these things together, I could probably brick my house. They're crazy crazy. I can't even bend them if I wanted to. And I don't, but just to give you an idea. So the counters are very good. You do have force markers in case you want to have an area that is really congested with the counters and you want to replace them and have them off to the side. And then of course you have your activation counters and things like that as well. At the top you have 2 decks of cards, one representing the first half of the game and then the other one representing the second half of the game. And they are going to be special events that occur during the game that can be played and used in the game as well. Okay, let's move on and take a look at combat. Okay, so we are going to get right at it and show you how combat works in 1944 War in the West. We are currently focused on northern Italy and Florence, and you can see the Allied and Axis armies are all kind of beginning to slam together, and we're going to have the first big duke out of these particular groups. So we're going to take on the Allies that they are attacking. They're going to be attacking from Florence. They're going to attack this German stack. So the first thing you do is you lay out the counters so that you can see them. And we're going to do the same thing for the Allied counters. Okay. And then you're going to add up the combat factors, and those are the ones in red. So 2, 4, 6, 8 for the Germans, and I just use a 20-sided die to kind of keep track of this for myself. And then we have 2, 4, 6, 8 for the Allies. And I'll set that right there. Okay, so now that we're getting ready for battle, this is where the basic value is 8 for each side. Then there are any modifiers that you can add. So for the attackers, you can augment it by air power if you've saved up some resource points for it. I have not, unfortunately, at this time. And then also, if there are other units in the area, you can take a chance at a coordinated attack and they can jump in the fray. The advantage of that is you can completely overwhelm your opponent. The disadvantage of that is if you make the wrong kind of a die roll, it could cancel the entire attack. And when in a game with only 14 turns, that can be pretty critical. If you need to break through that line, you may not want to risk a coordinated attack. So it's a nice little gamble. And then the defenders, they are, if they're allies, again, they could be augmented by Allied air power. These are Germans, so they can't. If they're in a city, which they are not, there would be a modification. If the Allied stack has American and British units, there's a negative penalty, but the Allied stack doesn't. It's all American. And so then for +1 for each adjacent friendly adjacent to the defender. So right there, they have +1, so that's actually +2. It's going to raise them to a 10. And the Germans had 1 friendly, so that is going to raise them to a 9. So now it's 10 to 9. And then +2 if it includes infantry and armor, or infantry and artillery, or +4 if it contains infantry, armor, and artillery. And this has infantry and armor, so this will give me +2, raising this to an 11. This one has infantry, armor, and artillery, so this is actually going to raise this to a 14. As soon as I can find the 14 there. There we go. So now we are 14 to 11. And then there's any terrain modifiers. Now they're attacking from, the Allies are attacking from Florence into this rough terrain. And rough terrain has a +2 for the defenders. So that's actually going to raise them up to 13. So now we are looking at 14 to 13. And then what you do is each side rolls a d6. The Allies rolled a crappy 1. And the Germans rolled a crappy 1. And you add it, making it 15 to 14. So the Allies won the fight. You divide it. What you do is you take the difference between the two. In this case, it's only 1. And you divide that by 2, and that's how many hits you would score on the enemy. So in this case, there's only 1. You divide it by 2 and you round down, but you have to do a minimum of 1 hit. So one of these is going to take a hit of some kind. So the defender may decide, hey, I'm going to flip that infantry over, and that infantry is now in a weakened state. And that's basically it. At that point, all the units go back onto the map. and a battle, that particular battle, is over. Now, it's important to note that in a particular combat, your stack of units can attack once, but they can defend as many times as they need to. So if you look at the particular map here, you can see that the Allies, they attacked here, but they're probably going to get hit here, here, and maybe even from there, right? So northern Italy is going to be mired in combat for the next definitely few weeks. It's very important, obviously, for the Allies to break through and start up a second front there, whereas elsewhere in the map, which we saw earlier, the battle around Normandy and in northern France has begun, and you can see that the Allies are starting to begin their steamroll to the west. Okay, now let's now that we've kind of looked at movement and combat and things like that, I want to take a look at the sequence of play so that you can understand what a game turn looks like, and we can kind of talk about everything, okay? So I'm going to pause there. Okay, so what does a game turn look like? Again, the sequence of play is located on the side of the map, on the side of the map so that you can go and easily follow it through. But in short, the first step in any game turn is a random event, and you have these card decks over here, and with those card decks, every player is going to get one. You'll have 2 in your hand, and you get to play 1. And they have a special event that is going to be used in each particular. If you're the German, you would get the top one. If you're the Allies, you would get the bottom one, and that will stay in play for the next turn. So you'll have 2 cards in your hand. You'll pick the one that you want to play, and what that does is it makes sure that special events are occurring, which mixes things up in the game. Okay, the second step that we're going to do is we're going to determine our resource points. So if you look up here in the corner, you can see on the turn guide, there's a number. So this is the second game turn right now. And in the second game turn, the Allies start with 8 resource points and the Germans start with 14. You'll take 2 dice of different colors, you'll roll them. The white is the positive, the red is the negative, and there you get a difference of 3 for the Allies. So the Allies would start out with 8 plus 3 or 11 resource points, where the Germans are going to start off with 14, and then the difference there is 2, so they are actually going to start off with 16 resource points. And they have little trackers here that you can go ahead and you can put on the board to kind of keep track of the resource points as you spend them. So the resource points are used for everything in the game. They're used to move your units. They're used for the Allies for air power support as you're conducting your attacks, which can be extremely valuable because it can add +2 to any combat. So very, very useful. Then you have depot actions. So supply is an extremely important part of the game. Every side has depots. Depots stretch back to primary points of supply, whether they be for Germany, Berlin, and Vienna, or the Allies, right? And depending on what point of the game you are, depots can be 5 apart or 4 apart. If you have units that are out of supply, they're actually going to weaken. And if you already have weakened units that are out of supply, they are going to be eliminated. So it's extremely important to keep track of all of your units and where they are in relation to supply depots. So, you know, this is a pretty dangerous spot here. The Germans start off with supply depots all over the place, which you're like thinking, wow, man, they have a great supply. They do, but it also costs 1 of your resource points to maintain a supply every turn if it's already in supply in a supply chain with your primary source of supply. So in the beginning of the game, the Germans have 9 depots. That means every turn they are spending 9 resource points of that 14 just to maintain all of their supply depots. It's a tremendous amount of strain on them. Where the Allies, they only start with 2, and because of that, they may be getting less resource points up front, but they can do a heck of a lot more because they're not confined. Well, as you can imagine, as the game goes on and the Allies start sweeping across the map, What do you see happen? You see the Allies starting to get more and more depots, and all of a sudden more of their resources are spent just maintaining their supply lines, making it actually harder to conduct some of the offensive the closer that you move and get through the game. So after you do the depot actions, and that's where you are adding depots or removing depots, you'll check the supply on units and you'll weaken them if need be. And then you will move. For every stack that moves, you have to spend one of your resource points. So again, that's a big deal. So units can't just be moving all over the place just because they're out there. They have to actually have, you have to spend resources to get them to move. And then you have combat, which we kind of discussed. And then you have bridges, where the Germans can destroy bridges to hopefully slow down the Allies. And the Allies can repair bridges to keep moving their steamroller the direction that they need to go. And then the next step is restoration of units. In the restoration of unit phase, the Allied units can spend resource points to actually take weakened units and strengthen them again. That again just representing the general the powerhouse of supply that occurred to the Allies in the Second World War. And then you have air power. The Allies can save any resource points, and that's handled on the map here. And those resource points, they can save them for the next turn to provide air power support to battles, which is very useful. If you've got the points, you want to save them for that, because it can tip the edge in a battle between you winning and losing and really changing the course of a corner of the board. After that, there's strategic bombing, where Allies get to do strategic bombing on German depots. And then after that, we have redeployment, where the Allies can redeploy 4 units and the Germans can redeploy 3 units. It helps, even if they've already moved, it allows reinforcements from friendly stacks to friendly stacks. Very useful. The Germans need to do it to get their units to the front as fast as possible. And then last but not least, you have reinforcements, which are all handled via the player reference card. And it actually tells you every single 2 weeks what units you get and where they're coming in on the board. So that is a game turn. So you're going to do that. You have, if you look at the corner, every 2 weeks you're going to get a game turn up until January 14th, 1945. So how do you win the game? Well, winning the game is not as easy as you would think. So at the end of any turn, if Berlin or Vienna is occupied by the Allies, the Allied player gets an immediate victory. If at the end of a turn, Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Brussels, Cologne, Kassel, Frankfurt, München, Milan, Paris, or Trieste are occupied by Allied units, the Allied player is going to get an immediate victory. So they all have to be occupied. So that's quite an endeavor to be aiming for. Otherwise, at the end of turn 14, a player whose units occupy at least 7 of the following cities: Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Berlin, Brussels, Cologne, Kassel, Frankfurt, München, Milan, Paris, Trieste, and Vienna, is the winner. If you occupy 7 of those, you'll be the winner. Any other outcome is a draw. Okay, so this is a challenging game because you have to keep your eye on the ball. It's easy to just start thinking, I am going to go whack units, but to win the game, you have to strategically know, hey, I need to occupy these cities, and I have to get my forces there, and I have to do it. I only have 14 turns to do it. So there's multiple approach vectors for the Allies to win, and the Germans, as the Allies start building up, they just need to hold them off and keep them from achieving their victory conditions. And if possible, they can occupy those 7 cities, and they could win the game by 1945 in January. So there you have it. That is kind of a high-level overview of 1944 War in the West. I'm going to move on now to my final thoughts. Okay, so War in the West, 1944. What did I think about it? So in the genre of war games where you can play World War II in 1 to 6 hours, this focuses in mostly on a portion of Western Europe. I think this is a fantastically fun game. I like the supply rules. I still don't quite get why the supply rules dropped from 4 to 5. I think the map is, it's kind of, like I mentioned before, it's kind of a print and play map, so you got to expect that when you take it out. But I love maps. I think it's a good quality map. The counters, again, I love these counters. They're not pretty, but they're the thickest, strongest, most durable counters I've ever seen in my life. And I don't know what they do differently from a company like GMT or Compass or all of the other board games, but the counters are great. I think the strategy cards are fine. The rules. So let's talk a little bit about the rules. I'm just going to pull these out so you can kind of take a peek at them. Do this the fun way. So like I said, the rules are really pretty good. There are a couple of rules that were kind of hidden in here and I couldn't find them. And an interesting thing about this game, some game companies put their rule books out there for you to download. I've not been able to find a copy of that rule book. That would really help. It would really help because you can always do finds and look for keywords and things like that, and then you don't have to dig. So I would have basically said, okay, this was okay, but I'm going to up it to good because of this, the extended play. And the extended play had everything in it that I, for the most part, was able to connect all of the dots. Is it great? No. But it is definitely good and puts this in the realm of playable. And when I say playable, it means I'm willing to spend an afternoon playing this game. It's not an exercise in frustration. So the rulebook is good, and the player reference card is good. They could be great, but they're good. And I'll take good. And when it comes to war games, I will take good any day. So that's really what it comes down to. I think it's a good game. I think I had a lot of fun with it. If I had one thing about the game that I didn't really like, it would probably be the victory conditions. And I'll just reread those to you just so that you can understand what I mean by that. But basically, to win the game, you have to, one side, there are a couple of conditions. If at the end of any turn, Berlin or Vienna is occupied by the Allies win the game. Well, that's pretty straightforward. I like that rule. At the end of a turn, if Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Brussels, Cologne, Kassel, Frankfurt, München, Milan, Paris, and Trieste are occupied by Allied unit, the Allied wins the game. So that's like 8 different cities you gotta control. And you're like, well, it's a war, of course. I think it would have been nice on the map to just indicate that, hey, this is one of your key cities, that you gotta, that the Allies would have to capture. Because I can't tell you how many times I'm like, okay, wait, what are the cities again? I have to capture Brussels. Yeah, okay, I gotta get to Brussels. I gotta, right? And maybe that's just, you're laughing at me now saying, young foolish wargamer. But it was just kind of a long list of cities. And then the other victory condition is at the end of turn 14, if a player occupies at least 7 of the following cities: Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Berlin, Brussels, Cologne, Kassel, Frankfurt, München, Milan, Paris, Trieste, and Vienna. If you own at least 7 of those, they're the winner. Any other outcome is a draw. So the game plays really fast, really furious, really fun. You can play the game in a few hours. The Germans come on, strong right away and are amazing, but quickly the Allied reinforcements just begin to steamroll. So, like with all war games, Germany is most likely inevitably going to lose the war. But as far as the game, that's a lot of really different victory conditions to kind of keep track of. And I really didn't like if you don't have 7 of those cities, the game's a draw. I think our house rule would have been whoever owns the most of those cities is the winner. I just didn't like the draw aspect of it. But overall, I think this is a fast, fun game. I did do some rule searching. I did kind of create, like I said, I created my own cheat sheet that had all of the rules in 2 pages that kind of conformed to my brain. And I pretty much only looked at this from the beginning to the end. Now I would post this, but I have a feeling that White Dog Games, because they don't even post their rule book, would not want me to post this. And that's okay, that's their prerogative. But it's all here. It's just sometimes a little bit of a search, and without a PDF, it's hard to search. You end up doing that looking. But overall, like I said, I'll give it a good. The game itself, I'm going to give a good. I'm going to play this again, and I don't always say that about war games. Some games I get done, war games I get done with them, I'm like, yep, that was an experience, and I'm all done. But not this one. This one is a fun. In the fast play World War II genre, this is a fun one, and I am looking forward. They also have one set in Poland, which I have purchased just because I had such a good time with this one. So I'm looking forward to playing that. And as I understand, the rules are very similar. So I'm looking forward to trying that out. So when it comes down to it, 1944, War in the West, is it worth your time? Yes, I think it is. It's a good game. It's good. Check it out. White Dog Games, well done. Have a good day. Don't forget to get lost in games. Take care of yourself out there. Bye now.